On January 17th, 2026, the White House issued a directive that fundamentally decouples American trade policy from traditional diplomatic norms. The President of the United States has officially linked the sovereign territorial status of an island in the North Atlantic to the import duties on luxury goods, automobiles, and industrial machinery from 8 European nations. Denmark, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Sweden are now facing a blanket 10% tariff. This is not a dispute over steel. This is not a dispute over digital services taxes or agricultural subsidies. The stated provocation is Denmark's refusal to negotiate the sale or joint administration of Greenland. For the first time in the post war era, the United States is using broad economic leverage against NATO allies to facilitate a land acquisition. $500 billion in annual trade is now contingent upon a real estate transaction. The mainstream press is calling this a diplomatic meltdown. The markets are calling it a volatility event. But the documents suggest this is a calculated application of national security trade authority used as a tool of geopolitical expansion. One shocking fact remains largely buried. The legal justification cited in the directive claims that the lack of direct U.S. administrative control over Greenland's rare earth mineral deposits constitutes an immediate threat to the American defense industrial base. The ultimatum is set. The clock has started. Why was the strategic mineral component of this story minimized in the initial reports? If you turned on the major networks last night, you saw a very specific narrative being constructed. The framing across CNN, MSNBC, and the BBC focused almost exclusively on the absurdity of the demand. They used words like erratic, unhinged, and diplomatic chaos. The emphasis was placed on the personality of the president and the shock of the Danish prime minister. This is the outrage frame. It focuses on the breach of etiquette rather than the mechanics of the policy. The media highlighted the immediate rejection by Copenhagen, framing it as a David versus Goliath struggle for sovereignty. What they ignored, or at least delayed in reporting, was the underlying economic data regarding the 8 specific nations targeted. These are not random selections. These 8 nations represent the core of the European Union's industrial and political decision-making bloc. By targeting the Netherlands and Belgium, the gateways for European shipping, and Germany, the industrial heart, the administration is attempting to bypass the Danish government and force the European Union to pressure Denmark into the negotiating table. We also see a distinct timing manipulation. This announcement comes just 3 weeks before the scheduled Arctic Council summit. By dropping this tariff bomb now, the U.S. has effectively hijacked the agenda of that summit. The media narrative suggests this is a sudden whim. However, if you look at the trade filings and the list of harmonized tariff codes included in the annexes of the announcement, this list was not compiled overnight. It is a highly specific list targeting high margin exports that these 8 countries rely on for their trade surpluses with the United States. The mainstream narrative minimizes the why. They treat the Greenland interest as a punchline to a joke from 2019. They ignore the reality that the global race for the Arctic is no longer a future projection. It is a current conflict. By framing this as a personality-driven tantrum, the media avoids discussing the uncomfortable reality of modern statecraft, the weaponization of trade for territorial and resource security. They want you to focus on the tweet. They don't want you to look at the mineral map. Here's what we know. On Saturday, January 17th, 2026, the president signed Executive Order 14208, titled Securing the North American Arctic Frontier. According to the text of the order, which has been verified by Reuters and the New York Times, the United States will impose a 10% ad valorem tariff on all goods originating from 8 specific European nations. The order explicitly states, and I quote, "The refusal of the Kingdom of Denmark to engage in good faith negotiations regarding the security and administrative status of Greenland represents a persistent vulnerability to the United States' national security interest in the Arctic Circle. The timeline of this escalation is documented. In 2019, the idea of purchasing Greenland was dismissed by the Danish government as absurd. For 6 years, the issue remained dormant in public discourse, though diplomatic cables recently leaked suggest the U.S. State Department has been quietly offering infrastructure investment packages to the Greenlandic local government in Nuuk since mid 2024. The documents we have reviewed list the targeted countries. It is not just Denmark, it is Denmark, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Sweden. Why these eight? Analysis of U.S. Census. Bureau trade data shows these countries account for over 80% of the European Union's total exports to the United States. By including Sweden and Germany, the administration is targeting the two most significant military and industrial powers in Northern Europe. We have a direct quote from the president's announcement on the White House lawn. Greenland is a strategic necessity for the defense of this country. If Denmark won't talk, their neighbors will pay the price for their stubbornness. We are done being taken advantage of by allies who won't help us secure our own backyard. Here is what we don't know yet. We do not know if there is a specific sunset clause in these tariffs. The documents mention a periodic review based on diplomatic progress, which is vague language that allows for indefinite extension. We also do not have the full list of exemptions. Usually, these tariff orders include a process for U.S. companies to request exclusions if the goods cannot be sourced elsewhere. That process has not yet been outlined, creating a vacuum of information for American importers. Furthermore, the legal standing is currently being debated. The administration is invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This allows the president to impose tariffs without congressional approval if a product is being imported in such quantities as to threaten to impair the national security. Usually, this is applied to the goods themselves, like steel. In this instance, the administration is arguing that the origin of the goods from countries that are obstructing Arctic security constitutes the threat. This is a novel and untested legal theory. The specific joint administration proposal mentioned in the Global Banking and Finance Report involves a 99-year lease of the island's resource rights in exchange for the total assumption of Greenland's annual subsidy, which is currently paid by Denmark. Denmark currently provides approximately $600 million a year to Greenland. The U.S. proposal, according to sources familiar with the draft, would triple that amount. The reactions have been swift, and they reveal a significant amount of hypocrisy across the board. The Danish Prime Minister issued a statement calling the move extortion, stating that sovereignty is not a commodity to be traded under the threat of economic sanctions. This is a standard and expected defense of national integrity. However, it's worth noting that the Danish government has historically been one of the most vocal supporters of using trade sanctions to influence the internal policies of other nations. When the tool is turned on them, the vocabulary shifts from leverage to extortion. In the United States, political opponents have moved into a state of high gear condemnation. We've seen several senators call this an abuse of power. Yet many of these same figures voted for the very legislation, the 2022 Arctic Security Act, which declared that U.S. dominance in the Arctic is a primary defense priority. They supported the ends, but are now horrified by the means. It is a classic case of supporting a policy in theory while disavowing the actual enforcement of that policy when it becomes politically inconvenient. The media figures on the major networks are currently engaged in a sudden narrative shift. For years, they have warned about Russian and Chinese incursions into the Arctic. They have published dozens of think pieces about the new Cold War at the North Pole. But now that the U.S. has taken an aggressive, albeit unorthodox, step to secure that very region, the narrative has flipped. The Arctic is suddenly no longer a strategic flashpoint in their reporting. It's a quiet region being disturbed by American aggression. Institutions like the World Trade Organization and NATO are in a state of paralysis. NATO, in particular, is facing a fundamental contradiction. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty requires members to defend each other. Now, the leader of the alliance is economically attacking 7 other members over a land dispute with an eighth. The silence from the NATO Secretary General is the most telling part of this reaction. They cannot condemn the U.S. without risking the collapse of the alliance, but they cannot support the U.S. without admitting that NATO is no longer a partnership of equals, but a hierarchy of interests. We see an overreaction in the financial markets as well. The euro fell 2% against the dollar within hours of the announcement. This isn't just because of the 10% tariff, it's because the market realizes that the rules based international order is being replaced by a results based national interest. Based on the information available so far, here is the prediction. Expect the European Union to announce a strategic autonomy retaliation package within the next 72 hours. This will not be a blanket tariff on all U.S. goods. Instead, based on past behavior patterns like those we saw in the 2018 steel disputes, the EU will laser target specific American exports produced in politically sensitive regions. Expect to see tariffs on bourbon from Kentucky, motorcycles from Wisconsin, and agricultural products from the Midwest. The media narrative will shift from Trump is crazy to a global trade war has begun by Tuesday. This matters because the goal of the European response won't be to actually hurt the U.S. economy. The U.S. is too insulated for that. The goal will be to create enough domestic political pressure within the United States to force a congressional intervention or a judicial stay on the Section 232 invocation. The Danish government will not fold this week. They cannot. To do so would be political suicide. However, watch for the local government of Greenland to remain curiously quiet. Their incentive is different. If the U.S. is offering billions in infrastructure compared to Denmark's millions in subsidies, the internal tension within the Kingdom of Denmark will begin to fracture. This isn't about an immediate sale. It's about making the cost of keeping Greenland higher than the cost of letting it go. Expect the administration to use the next week to leak more intelligence reports about Chinese mining interests in Greenland to justify the national security angle to a skeptical public. The battle for the narrative is about to get much more intense. This story is about more than just a 10% tax on German cars or French wine. It is about a fundamental shift in how the United States views its allies and its borders. The information we've laid out today, the specific legal codes, the strategic mineral context, and the targeted nature of these 8 nations, is being ignored by the mainstream outlets in favor of personality-driven drama. They don't want this information getting out. They prefer the narrative of chaos because it prevents you from seeing the underlying strategy. If you want to help us fight the algorithm and spread the truth, you know what to do. Your support allows us to keep digging through the filings when everyone else is just reading the headlines. Stay sharp, stay skeptical. We'll see you in the next brief.